Hey, welcome back, YouTube. So we have some great questions today on when does when do leaves and green chop and drop stuff go from being nitrogen heavy greens to carbon heavy browns? How does that work? Another question on grass in the gardens. How do I deal with grass in the gardens? What are some tips to keep the grasses out of your gardens? A little bit of grass is actually fine. We're going for a polyculture, and grass is part of a polyculture. The problem is when you have stuff like Bermuda grass and crabgrass that wants to just strangle everything out. Another question on raking leaves in a forest and clearing around stumps in like clearing around tree trunks in a forest. And then one more question on aerating your lawns. Should you aerate your lawns? Lawns in nature, grasslands in nature don't have humans aerating them, so why should I aerate my lawns? Is it still beneficial or not? So stick around and we'll get the answers to those questions. Okay, so one of the questions is, what do I do with grass in my gardens? How do I get rid of grass in a way that's not just mining the soil, pulling it out, and then basically systematically extracting nutrients? Okay, so first way to reduce grass from getting into your gardens is to cut little trenches along your gardens. That, like, eventually the grasses will creep down through the trench, like down into the trench, and then they'll get into the gardens. But for the meantime, if you do it every year, then you have like little micro swales, and then you also will stop those creeping grasses from getting in. The second thing is to sow over with something like clover, something you don't mind creeping in, and then hopefully the grasses get out competed that way. Okay, and then obviously, weeding them can get rid of them, but you want to try to not be disruptive to the soil. So, here I see that I actually have some, so I'm going to try to grab it all and pull it, but it's going to come out as this rhizome. See, so I'm going to try to dig under and get this whole rhizome out if I can. I'm still in the mulch layer. And these creeping grasses will come, right in from the outside and creep in. Once they're established in, it's very hard to get them out. So it's really just staying on top of it, pulling them out if you want. But then as far as systematically mining your soil of nutrients, what I basically do is you could compost this. That's one thing you could do, and then return the compost back to your garden. But you can also just basically, get it so that the roots are going to dry out, maybe on a rock, or just kind of hang them up on a plant for a day to dry out, and then you can kind of come pull it off later. But basically you just want this to dry out. If I drop it down on this, like, it probably won't root, like it almost certainly won't root, but if you want to be safe, you can just kind of hang them up. See, and what you don't want to do is what I just did, try to pull them out one-handed and then just pull out the grass, but not the rhizome, because then the rhizome will still propagate more grass. It'll just regrow. Now, if you keep pulling it, then it'll systematically mine it of energy, and it'll eventually give up. But you got to be really on top of it for grass. One other thing about that whole thing, systematically mining it of energy. So I often talk about in my videos that if I want to get rid of weeds, what I do is I basically just keep cutting them ground level. And then I win the energy and energy out battle against them. It doesn't really work with stuff like grass that's creeping from outside. And the reason why is because if you think about this whole area being grass, it's the photosynthesis engine that's driving the runners coming in. So you just pulling the runners out, cutting them ground level, dropping them down, you're not actually impacting the fact that there's another thing that's feeding that energy in. So you're never going to win that battle. That's only for something basically where it exists inside of your garden and you're cutting it, chopping it, dropping it. But if you have something from the outside that's feeding it coming in, then you have to really block those rhizomes if you want. So cutting a path and then also using underground walls. So here's an area on the swale where I have grass on the footpath, and then I bordered it with a wall of comfrey. Now I'd like to make this even thicker. This was actually just maybe 1, 2, 3 comfrey plants last year, and I propagated it to make it even thicker. I want to go even thicker next year, so this fall I'm going to double this wall up probably. So basically this underground, this comfrey's got such a big root system that like when you're looking underground, grass wanted to creep in, it's hitting a wall of comfrey roots. And then even if it does kind of poke in, it comes up and it's shaded right away. So it really has to push far through the comfrey to come out the other side. Now that's not to say it doesn't do it. I also have grass kind of coming in from the back side as well, creeping in here and there. It's not perfect, but it works really well. It actually works quite well. And it works even better if you can keep comfrey out of going to flower, for example, because it'll go to flower and then it'll kind of, flop over a bit. And when it flops over, it opens up light space and you can see grass, starting to push its way in. Okay, and related, I had another question. Say I'm chopping and dropping grasses. At what point does the green grasses, the nitrogen heavy grass that I would use as a chop and drop on top of carbon heavy wood chips, at what point does that become a brown? And where does all the nitrogen go? Okay, so it's going to be really hard for me to answer this carbon nitrogen decomposition one without getting too overly scientific and getting like really boring. Basically what it is that carbon is the building blocks of all life, and carbon bonds really easily to other things, but especially back to itself, back to carbon. So what that means is when something that's made out of carbon that has long protein chains in it, amino acid, fat chains, carbohydrate chains, those are made of carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and hydrogen and all the basic elements. And then also, some of the larger elements are in there as well. When that is cut and the plant dies and starts to decompose, the most stable thing in that plant is the carbon. So the carbon is actually going to last longer than the other stuff. Like the nitrogen will come off as nitrous oxide, which is not ideal, but all the elements will basically decompose and come out faster than the carbon will. And what you'll have left over afterwards, after a long time, is basically just the carbon in the cell walls of the plant. So if we look at some algae that I picked from the pond, we can kind of see, here's some fresh one and some older ones. So let's look at that. Okay, so where are we? We're here at the pond, the side of the house. So there's the pond there. This is my coppice sumac area, and I have a swale cut in here. Well, I have a swale up here, and then I have another swale roughly here. You want them kind of half around the height of the trees apart, or if you want to cram them a little tighter, maybe half of the height of the trees, but it's usually the height of the tree. If you took that tree and laid it down on the side, that's when you want to get your next swale in. But here I wanted to put one because I wanted to access the front of that swale eventually over time to be able to harvest out of the things that I planted in it. So I have a swale here, and I've planted one of my guilds that I'm doing now is plum. We've got some tomatoes, we've got some amaranth, various other plants. We've got some zucchini and melons, sunflower, and always clover, but I don't really see it coming up too much. I might have to sow some more clover in here. We got some yarrow. So we've kind of got the start of a little guild going here, and I've been collecting the algae and basically putting it under, plants that I really want to survive and do well, like the fruit trees. So here is some algae from today, and it's still wet, and this is basically still lots of nitrogen in it. And here is some algae from probably a couple days ago, and it's wet because I just watered this as well. Watered my wildflower hill, and this kind of got hit as well. But this will kind of dry out and decompose, and what'll be mostly left behind as this decomposes is the carbon that's left over. It'll mostly be carbon that gets left over. The carbon will get dragged down. It'll eventually all turn to soil. But if I just take this algae and I leave it on top, it'll get hard, and it'll slowly turn from a nitrogen heavy chop and drop to a carbon heavy chop and drop. It happens fairly slowly, and it's like a decay curve. If you've ever seen like a battery discharge curve, the shape of that, it's like an exponential growth, exponential decay curve. It just follows that curve, and that's basically the nitrogen going down, and the carbon goes down as well. It just has a slightly longer, so it's like two curves. The nitrogen would kind of go like this, and then the carbon would just kind of go like that. So as the longer you go in time, the more carbon that you have, and the nitrogen's already kind of been volatilized and it is basically out of it. So that's basically it. Even like if you think about trees, the newest growth, the leaves, they will be actually they're a decent carbon source, but mostly when they're dried. But fresh leaves off of a tree are going to be actually a decent nitrogen source as well. It's quite a more balanced, kind of ideal for decomposing source of carbon and nitrogen. As the leaves dry out, it basically turns into almost a pure carbon amendment, where year-old leaves crushed up, dried, and spread on your garden beds is almost entirely just carbon that's left over. Also, raspberry season starting. And when you're picking raspberries, just give it a little tug. This goes for most fruit. Give it a little tug, and if it doesn't want to come off freely, it's not ready. If it wants to come off freely, then it's ready. And these as well. Oh my God. I can't believe it's raspberry season. I think I like them better than anything else. They are so good. And there are no more that are ready. What was I saying? Lost my train of thought. That was so good. Like it's just... Oh my God. Wow. I can't remember what I was saying. I like raspberries. Oh, I know what I was saying, because I looked back and rewatched it. I was talking about when I pick them, how I like to pick them a little before they're ripe. I mentioned this in some of my more recent videos, but the longer that I do this, the more I start picking fruit just a little early. I don't want any berries staying super ripe on the plant, and especially low down near the ground. And that's because I don't want fruit flies who lay their eggs in the soil to be able to get up into the fruit. I want to get it before they smell that there's like really nice fruit there. So when your blackberries, raspberries, even strawberries are ready and they're coming, try to get out there every single day, like every day, and pick them even before they're perfectly ripe. If you want them to like ripen up even further, bring them inside the house, but really try to get them off the plant, and especially off the ground. If any have fallen down, try to get them off the ground before the fruit flies start becoming a problem, or slugs, because those will become a problem if you don't get them right away. So every single day harvest those berries when they're ready. Okay, one more question actually on aeration. Ben asks, what's the deal with aeration? Is it beneficial to lawns? If so, why? Because it's not like grasslands in nature have humans going around aerating it. So the answer to that is yes, it is very beneficial to lawns. You want to get oxygen and water, but it's mostly for oxygen, to get down deep into the subsoils as far down as possible. Now, grasslands don't have humans aerating them and babying them, and the reason why is because natural grasslands also don't have humans mowing them. So what happens here, for example, in this lower area, is I mow it maybe every 2 weeks or so. I always mow at the highest lawnmower settings to try to keep as much shading of the soil as possible, but I do mow in here, and I'll mow right around. Nature doesn't have that really happening. The closest thing to that is basically large ruminants walking around grazing it, but they're not going to systematically graze it and take it right down, and they're also going to be defecating on it as they graze it. So our lawns, it is beneficial to aerate them because we are constantly mowing them and keeping them in this vegetative state where the lawns are growing almost pure nitrogen leaves. We're cutting them, and we're, even if we're mulching with like a mulch blade, we're dropping those the nitrogen back. Sorry, I'm just in my sandals. I just want to make sure I'm not walking on poison ivy. What happens in a natural grassland is that the plants are allowed to go through their full vegetative state. So they're allowed to, here's what grass actually looks like. They're allowed to go up and turn into seed. They're allowed to make these rigid, hard, carbon-heavy stalks and then release their seed, dry the grass stalks out, and eventually fall over throughout the course of a year. That carbon from that carbon-heavy rich stalk is being put down on the ground, and worms are kind of allowed to live inside of it more. It's a balanced ecosystem a little more, and you have a lot more natural tunneling that goes on. You have bigger, stronger grass roots because they're allowed to go straight to seed. You have more natural fluffing and aeration going on in a wild grassland than you do in something like a lawn, where the human is constantly cutting it and keeping it from going to those tall stalks of grass. So in a natural ecosystem, it doesn't need humans to aerate it because it's kind of doing it itself. And that really comes back to my core philosophy of permaculture. And that's, as soon as a human takes an action in these systems that have evolved naturally, just with nature doing everything the way that it does, when humans come in and interrupt those processes from going throughout their full, look at this. Those are nice. Some phloxes. Those were my grandmother's favorite. That's cool. Cool to see that they lived. But when humans come and interrupt those things, then humans have to come in and take further actions because we basically just destabilize the whole entire chain of events that follows that. So aeration is kind of one of those things. Nature or natural ecosystem with the plants going through their full life cycles will have more natural aeration in the soils. They'll have more organic matter dumped on the soils. They'll have fluffier, deeper loams. So they have more just natural aeration. So it is still beneficial to aerate your lawn if the human is coming, mowing it constantly and keeping it in that vegetative state. Okay, so Ben had another question about leaves. He says he's got an older growth forest, kind of like this. This is a cedar monoculture, basically, in here. And just imagine it's just oaks and chestnuts and maples, leaf litter down. He said that he's been going around trees and how I say basically to remove from, like, expose the root flare of the trees. I wouldn't worry too much about raking leaves away in your forest. You can do it if you want, but like you say, nature doesn't really have humans walking around forests raking trees away, so how do they survive? Well, really, the answer to that is some don't. Some do have boring insects crawl into them and kill them, and that's part of the cycling back of nutrients. So it's a very valuable thing that does happen, actually, is insects taking down trees. If you don't want that happening, you know, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be a big problem, but if you don't want that happening, you can rake leaves away from your trees if you want. You certainly don't need to, though. So thanks for watching. Please keep sending your feedback and comments, and I'll see you on the next one.